Well, welcome to this lesson on photosynthesis. It might look like a lot of terms, but actually most of these, they're going to be on the diagram on slide 6 or so. So most of these don't need definitions, just a few at the beginning there like autotrophs and chloroplast. So look for these when we do our photosynthesis diagram a little later on in the lesson. I think a good analogy for what we're about to see with photosynthesis is solar power. This picture shows a solar farm with a lot of solar panels out in the field. That's those blue panels you see. But that's not the only solar power that's happening here. All of that grass, trees, and farmland nearby, oddly enough, is actually capturing more energy, up to twice as much energy per unit area than the solar panels. Photosynthesis is nature's way of capturing sunlight and storing it as chemical energy, the food that supports the rest of the life here on the surface of the earth. So without further ado, let's have our lesson on photosynthesis. Defining photosynthesis is putting together with light. Photo means light, synthesis means to stitch together. So this process of transforming light energy into chemical energy is our photosynthesis. Since plants and um, other uh, other organisms can do photosynthesis, we call them autotrophs. They are self-feeding. They are the producer organisms that make their own food and thereby food for the rest of us, the plants, the animals, and anything that needs to eat those plants. So photosynthesis, plants are autotrophs. Let's have a quick look at our plant cells. Let's remind ourselves where we started and look a little closer at the chloroplasts where this is going to happen. In our diagram, we've got over here on the left the plant cell. We know it's a plant cell because of those nice cell walls on the outside. And additionally, we've got our chloroplasts. Up to this point, they've been fairly small in our diagrams. We can look at them a little bit more closely and see that there's some more advanced internal structure there. I'm going to switch to a flat diagram on the next slide, and we're going to take a look at what's happening inside those chloroplasts. What's happening to take different materials into the cell and what comes out. This is where we're going to spend most of our time because this is where most of our terms show up. Big picture on this is to realize what's going into photosynthesis and what's coming out of photosynthesis. Your inputs and your outputs are these things here. So please note what's going into the chloroplast and what's coming out, and which side of the reaction things are coming in or coming out. In photosynthesis, we've got the photo part. We've got the light. So here's our sun, and here's the light coming on in. The light is going to come into these green things that make the chloroplast so green. Each of these little discs is a thylakoid. Thylakoid. Thylakoids. Thylakoids house the pigment chlorophyll that does this process, the initial step of photosynthesis. Now you see an arrow going into the thylakoids. If you've taken care of plants at all, you know that plants need water. Water comes into chloroplasts. However, that plant or that other organism that can do photosynthesis is getting water, but it gets into the chloroplasts in this case, and sunlight combined with that water, a little chemical reaction happens. Oxygen is going to come out. Now that's important for you and me because I don't know about you, but I kind of like to breathe oxygen. Oxygen keeps me alive, keeps you alive, keeps anything that's not an autotroph alive. So H2O and sunlight are coming into the thylakoids and oxygen's coming out. Now if you look at that, process, oxygen's coming out, H2O is what was going in. That means the H is going somewhere. Where is it going? Before I get too far ahead of myself, Let's go ahead and label one moment here. This was our thylakoid, and that whole stack of them we call a granum. Not grandma, granum. Those stacks of thylakoids are granums. The hydrogen is going to pass off in its molecule that I'm going to draw down in the box. This is a high energy molecule called NADPH. The H tags a ride with NADP, and enters this other side we call the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle is where the energy really gets captured and produced. Again, we're keeping our focus on inputs and outputs, what goes into and out of this reaction. Carbon dioxide, CO2, which you might recognize as the gas that we are breathing out, is what plants need to breathe in. They're going to take carbon dioxide combined with that water and the power of sunlight through the Calvin cycle to make our final product, C6H12O6, which you know better as glucose. This is a sugar you've probably seen before when we've talked about carbohydrates, and we'll mention that again in a moment. But this is the main sugar that photosynthesis is making, and it's grabbing the carbon from carbon dioxide, the hydrogen from water, and the oxygen from carbon dioxide to make these sugars. Now it needs energy to do that. The Calvin cycle needs energy, and it gets it from this whole side over here that we call the, let's go ahead and call that the light side, or the light dependent side. On the light-dependent side of things, water's coming in, oxygen's going out, sunlight is powering up the thylakoids to create some energetic molecules. We've already mentioned one of them, it's NADPH. They're also going to make some ATP. Those two molecules combined together are the energy that drives the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle's grabbing carbon dioxide, turning it into sugar. These two sides of our photosynthesis reaction, the light-dependent side and the light-independent side work together to turn these items into sugar. Light-independent, sometimes called the dark side, but it doesn't have to happen in the dark. It just doesn't need light. So this is the light-independent side. The light-independent side is going to use up the power that was in those high energy molecules like ATP and NADPH, and it's going to discharge them. So it turns into ADP and NADP. NADP plus, and there's the H that it loses. Oops. There's the P that the ADP lost. For those items there in the middle, the ATP and ADPH plus, you can just think of those as like batteries that got charged and then used up. So there's that cycle there in the middle. They're charged and they're discharged. They get their power from the light side and they get used up on the light independent side. In general, our reaction here is that we have two inputs, water and carbon dioxide, each going into our two different sides. Oxygen and glucose are coming on out. This is probably one to focus on, and I've actually attached this this drawing with even a little bit higher resolution drawing on it as a separate PDF elsewhere in Google Classroom. Let's go and wrap up on our idea of photosynthesis. What are you going to do with all this glucose? Let's remind ourselves. Remember that we're trying to maintain homeostasis in living things. We're trying to self-regulate and maintain the ability to survive. The glucose is going to help plants do that. Remember, We are having metabolism going on. There's chemical reactions happening in living cells to release chemical energy and synthesize new organic materials. You just saw an example of the synthesize, make new organic materials. I'm trying to get my pen tool back here. Making new organic materials. So, if we're synthesizing stuff from light, that's the photosynthesis. What do we need the glucose for? By way of reminder, whenever plants or living things are processing things in these chemical reactions, we're using our big five elements: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And specifically here, we're seeing the carbohydrates, CH and O and glucose, that the plant is then going to use. The next slide, again, is one you've seen before, but let's remind ourselves of what this glucose is here for. What is it doing? Our carbohydrates, like we've said, are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And here now you see how we're getting this molecule, the glucose. We got it from photosynthesis. What's the plant going to do with it? Well, it's going to be a source of energy and it's going to be a source of structure. The plant is going to build itself using long chains of glucose in the form of cellulose. Again, a slide you've seen before, but now we've got more context for it. Where did all of these little hexagons of glucose ultimately come from? They came from photosynthesis. So the starch in a potato, all the glucose is there, came from photosynthesis. Any glycogen that I might have in my body from things I ate, those glucoses came from photosynthesis in some plant that I ate. Cellulose, so the actual structure of a tree or other fibrous plant, again, that's all coming from photosynthesis. Different ways of putting together those little hexagons, those monosaccharides, these carbohydrate pieces we call glucose. Funny thought to perhaps consider. Remember where the carbon in the glucose is coming from? Maybe look back at your diagram if you've taken some notes. All of that carbon in the glucose came from carbon dioxide, which came from the air. Plants, oddly enough, doing photosynthesis, are building themselves out of air and a little bit of hydrogen from the water that they drink. That's it. See you in the next one.